Okay, Brad, you hear us? You hear us okay?
I can hear you. There's an echo, but I can make it out.
So, Brad, first of all, thank you for being part of our first startup week. We really appreciate your time tonight. You talked a lot about startup communities. This community, we're going to talk more about this, would not have been able to hold a startup week to the extent that we're doing this week a couple of years ago. So we've really come a long way, and so it's exciting to have a real thought leader like you participate in this week. So I got to ask you, for starters, have you ever been to Chattanooga?
And just making sure you guys can hear me. So give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, since the feedback's great. Good. I have not been to Chattanooga. I've been to Tennessee a bunch of times for various things, but most of the time I've been to Nashville. I was actually born in Blytheville, Arkansas, near Memphis. So I only lived there a year, but know the edge of Tennessee from that perspective. And so I haven't been to Chattanooga, but I've been invited a number of times, and obviously, very excited about what y'all have done with Gigabit Internet.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we want to get you down here when you have Tennessee as one of your marathon states. We want that to take place here in Chattanooga. You would love it here. We actually have a lot of similarities with Boulder. Great outdoor activities, beautiful area, and just a great outdoor town. Some people actually call Chattanooga the Boulder of the East, but around here we say that Boulder is the Chattanooga of the West.
Fair enough.
But we really do have tried to emulate some of the great things in Boulder, not only outdoors, but also on the entrepreneurial front. So, again, we thank you for being part of this tonight. So, your book, Startup Communities, I got to tell you, I don't know if you give any prizes to people who buy over a certain number of books, but I've bought about 50 of them. So, when I became...
For 50, I'll do whatever you want me to do. I give you a hug, I give you a high five.
Come to Chattanooga to run the marathon next year.
Fair enough. On my list.
So actually, your book came out in 2012. I was CEO of CoLab that year, and I bought it. We convened a new board, and I bought it for all of our board members. And then a year later, I became head of Launch Tennessee. And again, I went and bought your book and gave it out to 23 board members. So we really have used that as a tool to educate, a lot of the feeders that you talk about their role. So we thank you for what you've done, and hopefully everybody here I know they'll enjoy the book. So in the book, you lay out the Boulder thesis. If you would talk about that, share those tenets with the audience.
So the Boulder thesis has 4 principles, and my goal when I put it together was I was trying to reflect back on what had happened in the 15 years that I lived in Boulder. I moved to Boulder in the mid-90s, and I also was trying to make it something that, in hindsight, once a startup community got up and rolling, it would feel obvious, right? Those are the best sorts of principles, ones that people can get their minds around and use as a framework. So the 4 principles that came out of that all link together. The first is that the startup community has to be led by entrepreneurs. In the book, and you referred to it, I separate between the notion of leaders and feeders. And what I didn't do well in the book, when I read back 2 years later and have listened to a lot of the feedback that I've gotten, is I didn't do a good enough job of emphasizing how important both the leaders and the feeders were, but how different their actual roles were. The leaders have to be the entrepreneurs. The feeders are everyone else. So university, government, nonprofits, investors, venture capitalists, service providers like lawyers and accountants, big companies that support entrepreneurship in their city. And the fundamental challenge is that in the absence of a critical mass of entrepreneurs playing a leadership role, startup communities don't develop. Some stuff happens, but they don't really develop and grow. One of the challenges that you run into over and over again is that historically, the feeder organizations, many of which are hierarchical organizations, try to control and manage the startup community without really realizing that a startup community, like a startup, is just this messy network of things that you can't really control. You have to nurture, you have to put energy into it, but you have to let things succeed and fail. You have to let things take their own course. And your goal is to try to get that activity moving versus organize and control it. So the first principle was that entrepreneurs have to be the leaders. The second is that you have to play a very long-term game. You have to have a long-term view. And I like to talk about this being at least a 20-year view. Startups take a long time to get up and going. Every now and then, sure, you hear of a startup that after 2 or 3 years gets bought for $1 billion. But the vast majority of startups take 5, 10, 15, 20 years to become successful businesses. And the same is true of startup communities. It has to be something that you're willing to invest energy in over a long period of time. Now, I was forced into defining what long period of time meant by my publisher, Wiley. I wanted to leave it open-ended. So the way I describe it to people today is I've now lived in Boulder 19 years, and I'm not 19 years into my 20-year journey. I'm 19 years into my 39-year journey. And my journey will end at some point, whether I want it to or not. The trick is that you have to constantly be looking forward with a long-term view. The third principle is that you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage at any level. Leaders, feeders, first-time entrepreneurs, experienced entrepreneurs, investors, angel investors, failed entrepreneurs, people that are moving to your city, people that have done things in your city are now moving somewhere else. You have to think of it as this network where your goal is to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage in the startup community. I use a phrase that I originally called give before you get that I now has been shortened to give first. And it's a tenet of Techstars, which is a mentor-driven accelerator that I helped start in 2007. And give first really is the essence of this notion of inclusiveness. It's similar to a concept probably a lot of you have heard, which is pay it forward, which is somebody once when you were younger did something for you to help you in your career, and now you're going to pay it forward by doing something for somebody else that's early in their career. What give before you get means is that you're willing to put energy into something without knowing what you're going to get out of it. You don't have to define the relationship transactionally going into it. You're willing to give before you get. It's not altruism. You expect to get something back, but you don't know when, from whom, in what currency, and in what magnitude. So you're willing to put energy into the startup community, knowing that in the future, you're going to get something back. And when I was thinking about how I've lived my professional life, I've lived my professional life essentially this way. And the amount that I've gotten back by putting energy into things is orders of magnitude more than I'd get if I defined all those relationships transactionally. The last principle is that you have to have activities and events that engage the entire entrepreneurial stack on a continual basis. So by this, I don't mean cocktail parties. I don't mean Entrepreneur of the Year awards. Those things are nice, but you actually have to do things where you're engaged in the process of entrepreneurship together. So accelerators like Techstars, things like Startup Weekend, things like Startup Week, where you're actively coming together as a community and really engaging and understanding what's happening in all the different facets of the community in terms of entrepreneurship. So these four principles, this notion of activities and events that engage everyone involved in the startup community, this idea of inclusiveness of anyone who wants to engage, a very long-term view, and the need for there to be a critical mass of entrepreneurs who are leaders. Not all the entrepreneurs have to be leaders, but you need a critical mass of them, are the things that I believe can allow you to create a startup community that's sustainable and growing in virtually any city.
So which of those four tenets, Brad, do you typically see as kind of being the most troublesome and that trips communities, startup communities?
Well, all four of them trip people in different ways. So I'll kind of quickly give an example of each one. So in the first one, a lot of times you see, especially as there starts to be some momentum in the startup community, you see organizations that want to take control of it or that want to organize it. This is very true often of universities, where the university kind of views itself as the center point or the important point of what's going on in the startup community. It's an important contributor, but universities are not very fast moving. They tend to be ponderous, they're slow to change, and they tend to have a lot of hierarchy in terms of how things get done. So when a university all of a sudden tries to position itself as the center of the startup community, lots of things stall. You often see that happen also with government in cities when all of a sudden things start to be exciting. You've got some startups happening. You've got some companies that are starting to be successful. You have some more and more enthusiasm around it. And all of a sudden, local government often comes in and starts to try to, again, organize it from an economic development perspective. There's a lot of things local government can do to be helpful, but this notion of organizing what's going on is not particularly effective. So that's the entrepreneurs as leaders. In the context of long-term view, I get asked this question all the time. We've been doing a startup community now for 3 years. How are we doing? And my response is, it just doesn't matter. Call me back in 17 years. How are we doing compared to, last year? It doesn't matter. How are we doing compared to such and such a city? It doesn't matter. Just focus on building your startup community and taking the long view of building your startup community. Inclusiveness is a really interesting one. Lots of people say, well, that's cool. I like this idea of inclusiveness. We get that in Boulder, pot is legal, and you guys are hippies, and you sort of, are inclusive of everybody. It's all a good, happy thing. But what happens if we compete with each other? We're competing for scarce resources. Maybe our businesses are competing. Maybe we had a bad relationship. Why should I be inclusive of that person? And the answer is, when you're working on startup community, you're such a small part of the overall ecosystem of a city that the idea that you can work together to try to build collaboratively is so much more powerful than this notion of fighting over scarce resources. Really, you're competing with everything else that's going on that's not part of the startup community. And so I see a lot of times, especially as startup communities start to make some progress, some people have disagreements, or they feel excluded, or they feel like I'm not part of the in club. What I tell people when they start feeling that is, look at yourself, evaluate your own behavior. Are you giving before you get? Are you contributing, or are you just taking? Because a lot of times the people who say that are ones who aren't actively contributing to the startup communities. They're people that they're looking for a job. They're trying to figure out how they can make money on the startup community or on entrepreneurship. So this dynamic shifts and self-selects. But really, the key comes from having this philosophy, this continued philosophy of saying, it's okay to screw up, it's okay to make mistakes. Let's try to figure out how to move things forward. The one last thing on the events, I hear this all the time. Oh my God, now that we've got things going, we've got too many events. There's stuff going on every night. There's 3 things going on every night. I can't possibly go to all the events. And oh, by the way, I can't go to the events because I got work to do. I got a company to run. And I tell people to take a deep breath. The goal is not to go to all the events. The goal is not to be part of everything that's going on. It's to pick a couple of things that you have passion for and that you think are going to have an impact on you and your business, and put real energy into those parts of the startup community. It's not to go wide, especially as things start to make progress. It's to go deep.
Yeah. That's great. Well, again, I think you would like Chattanooga from the standpoint on this inclusiveness and collaboration, because it's really a method here and a process that we call the Chattanooga Way, and has really come into play over the last 25 years on a number of different projects as this community's been revitalized. And so we take a lot of pride in saying, come to the table without your agenda and figure out where your role is and where you can help and what the end game is and how you can contribute. It's not perfect. It never is. But it is something that's very vibrant, and it's kind of in our DNA here. So I am going to test that to a bit. I was reading your blog this weekend, and I love the concept of the collision of the tucked and the untucked. So my contention is that Chattanooga is a place where that's happening, and those two worlds are meshing very well. But so before I get Brad to talk about what that concept is, I'm going to ask anybody who has their shirt untucked to please stand up. All right, that's perfect. That's about half the crowd. Actually, even more than half the crowd. Way to go. All right, y'all get an extra prize as well. So I guess I should have untucked my shirt. So there you go. And we really do. Actually, if you will now, Brad, talk a little bit about that, what that concept is all about.
Yeah, I was at the Up Global annual summit. For those of you that aren't familiar with Up Global, it was the merger of the Startup America Partnership and Startup Weekend. And it's a very rapidly growing national organization now. And we had our national summit sometime in the summertime in Las Vegas, which is warm. It was kind of warm. And I was giving a talk was sort of the origin of the idea for the next book I'm going to write about startup communities, which right now has a really deep title, Startup Communities 2. We'll come up with a better title by the time it actually comes out. But the conversation was basically, okay, we've been at this for a couple of years, now what? Like, what are the common problems that start to appear? And two of the people that were on the panel, I think Andy was the one who said this, two members of the Des Moines startup community, Andy and Amanda, basically said, it's the thing you start to see is this collision of the tucked and the untucked. And the collision is the untucked representing the network, the startups, the entrepreneurs, the organizations that are sort of messy and not well organized. The tucked represents the hierarchies, the organizations that have structure, the sort of larger organizations. And the linkage between tucked and untucked was that a lot of the untucked were entrepreneurs, and a lot of the tucked were the feeders. So again, this leader-feeder dichotomy. And the challenge is in year one or year two, nobody notices. So the untucked just kind of do whatever they're doing. And by year 3 or year 4, the untucked and the tucked are starting to interact a lot, and there's lots of things happening, but you do have a culture collision. And I thought it was a very clever way to describe the difference between, in some cases, the leaders and feeders, or the network and the hierarchy. Again, one's not better than the other, they're just different. And in the context of the startup community, you need them to work together effectively. And so this notion of getting the tucked and the untucked together, and one of the comments that came out of it that I put in the blog post was this idea of doing a Sadie Hawkins event where the tucked come untucked and the untucked come tucked. Like it's a little bit, it's very interesting though. You can almost always tell some of it's generational, but a lot of it's functional. A lot of it's what role you play. And in my first company, which was in Boston, we had a rule, which is you can wear whatever you want to wear as long as it's clothing. And we had some people. I was a t-shirt and jeans guy, so I would show up in t-shirt and jeans and running shoes every day. I upgraded my wardrobe a couple of years ago because my wife got sick of my t-shirts. She said, for a guy who's done reasonably well, I got an awful lot of free t-shirts with words on them. We had a guy in my office named Mark who ran our network integration group, which we called at the time the hardware department. And Mark came and showed up every day in a suit and tie. It's what he felt comfortable wearing to work, and that was totally fine. So this notion of being inclusive is so important. You want to be inclusive of the tucked and the untucked. And just because someone's untucked doesn't mean that they don't fit into whatever's going on, and vice versa.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that I guess I read your blog, and the day you wrote it, you were going to an event at Blackstone Group. And we have been very fortunate at Lawrence, Tennessee, the last 2 years to be recipients of Blackstone innovation grants to help support some of the new programs we've started here across the state. And so I've been up there a number of times, and I have not seen many untucked there. So I relish the thought of seeing you walking in there with a lot of suits untucked.
Well, it was a fun. It was a fun.
Chattanooga, how many more? How much more prolific the untucks are. And the other measure is just how many more people are riding their bike to work in shorts and with a hat on backwards, and it's great. And it's just we didn't have that 5 years ago, and now it's just nearly rampant. So it's really, I think, a good sign of progress. I won't ask you the question that you said everybody asked you, because I was going to ask it to you about metrics for a community. So I will, Chattanooga, in my estimation, we're about in year 4 or 5, really, of that journey since it really started to get legs. So we are thinking about and saying, what should we be looking at, and what are the things that we're looking at over the next 3 years in terms of progress? But I'll tell you one that's more intangible that I talk about a lot, and you talked about failure. And this, I have a hard time saying celebrating failure, but I will say more, at least an acknowledgement of it, and that it's not punitive. So the best example I got, I was taking some of our companies out in Silicon Valley last year, and was talking to folks out in the valley, and they were talking about mature ecosystem. They said mature ecosystem is one where an entrepreneur who's failed is celebrated, or again, he gave the example, if this was your brother-in-law and you invested in his business and it failed, he said, would you invite him to Thanksgiving the next year? And I said, well, his family, I'd invite him to Thanksgiving. He said, well, would you put him at another table? And would you make sure that everybody knew not to dare bring up the story of his company? And I said, yeah, that's the South. We just kind of sweep it under the rug. And he said, that brother-in-law at Silicon Valley Thanksgiving has the head of the table. He's the rock star as long as he's committed to getting back up on that horse and starting another company. So it was interesting to think about that. I'd love any comments that you kind of have around that topic.
Yeah, I think the way you describe the dynamic between accepting failure on one end of this, sort of the midpoint of the spectrum, rejecting failure, which would be one end of the spectrum, and celebrating failure at the other end of the spectrum. I think the natural place is somewhere in between the midpoint and celebrating failure. I think the Silicon Valley example is a little oversimplified, because I think that the person would be at Thanksgiving. I think people would be talking about it. I don't think there would be any shame. But I'm not sure that they would be at the head of the table and they'd be the rock star until they started their next company. So I think the dynamic is it's got to be okay to fail. It's got to be a natural part of the startup process. It's got to be something that whoever fails isn't ashamed of. And it has to be something that you have a support system and an ecosystem around you, support structure and ecosystem around you that allows you to quickly get back on your feet. It can't be a dynamic where there's sort of this, oh, great, you failed, how awesome. That's bullshit. That's not how it feels. It sucks to fail. It's miserable. It's unhappy. It never feels good. But as an investor, if the entrepreneur I've invested in fails, but tried hard, learned, was gracious, communicated, I want to invest in that person again, because they're going to have a much better shot the next time from all the stuff they learned from. The only time failure isn't something that's okay is when the person in the context of failure doesn't deal with it in a way that's graceful, that's ethical, that treats people with respect, that treats whatever's going on with respect. And this doesn't mean that there's a certain type of failure that's better than others. It's just how you comport yourself as an entrepreneur in the context of something not working. I think this is especially important for startup communities, because the entrepreneur who's been through a failure in a lot of ways is a much more powerful entrepreneur even than some entrepreneurs who have been successful. And the entrepreneur who's had a success and a failure is my favorite entrepreneur, because that entrepreneur knows what both taste like. And oftentimes she has a chip on her shoulder. She really wants to go make the next thing work. And it's even more important to have the next thing be a success. So I really encourage people to not overthink it, to not to build a culture around it, but not avoid it. I think this, for a lot of human beings, the brother-in-law example where he's sitting at the other table and nobody's talking about it, that might be actually worse than if he wasn't invited, because it's what everybody's thinking about. Like, let it out. It's okay. You lost our money. You tried hard. You did it gracefully. When are you doing it again? Like, we're ready to support you again. Get going. Like, that's so powerful for somebody on the receiving end to hear after they've struggled with something. And I think if you add that up across the ecosystem, it really multiplies nicely.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I should have said, we will leave about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. So obviously there's lots of good things to be thinking about here. We'll give you a chance to ask Brad some questions. Brad, as you may have heard Dana say, it is Gimme Fiber Day. And we have folks from the National Fiber Council here. And EPB has given this community a terrific gift in the form of our fiber network. And, we were the first city to really have that throughout the entire community. We had folks from Google here about 3 months ago, and we were having some fun with them talking about, once again, Chattanooga led, Google followed. And so we've very much been tracking what they're doing. I know you spent some time in Kansas City. I'm curious with what you've seen in Kansas City with the Google fiber rollout there, how has that impacted that community and the entrepreneurs within that?
So not just have I spent time in Kansas City. I've been in Kansas City on and off since the mid '90s because I've had a long relationship with the Kauffman Foundation. But when Google announced that they were going to do fiber in Kansas City, I was part of the effort in Boulder to be the city that Google announced that they were going to roll out with first. And we put a lot of effort into it and obviously didn't get it. There's a number of reasons we didn't get it that we know about, and probably plenty that we didn't. But when Kansas City got awarded it, I thought that was pretty awesome. I had no idea what was going to happen, but because I'd spent a lot of time in Kansas City, I thought it would have some impact. And when it started rolling out, the story's worth telling because it talks about, it's an example of give before you get. And it's also an example of how just asking causes things to happen. So I was giving a talk at Think Iowa, which was a conference in Des Moines. And I came a day early and spent a day, with a bunch of people in the startup community in Des Moines. And then I was at this conference, 300, 400 people. It was great. It was one of those, really highly curated, fun, one-day events that sort of sneaks up on you with its quality. And in the middle of the day, during a break, this guy comes up to me, super nervous, anxious, sticks out his sweaty hand and says, "Hi, my name's Ben. I've started a hacker house in Kansas City because of the Google Fiber, and I'd really love you to come visit and any help you can. I think your startup community stuff is great." And I said, "Slow down, Ben. Tell me more about, the hacker house." And Ben had bought a house in the middle of this first neighborhood that was being rolled out. And for those of you that know Kansas City, it's on state line around 45th. And he had 5 companies in the house that they'd wired up with Google Fiber, and he had 5 companies that were renting the house from him and using it as a workspace. That's pretty amazing. I think I want to buy a house in Kansas City. And I said that to Ben. I said, "Are there more houses in that neighborhood for sale?" And he says, "Yeah." I said, what would you think of me buying a house near you? Is that cool?" And he's like, "That would be amazing." And I then reached out to a couple people I knew to just make sure Ben was, his name's Ben Barath, that he was the real deal. He's the real deal. And then I asked him and a woman named Lisa Mitchell from the Kauffman Foundation. I said, "Look, I want to buy a house. I don't want to put any energy into it. Can you guys find me the house if I'll do it, and we'll do some noise around it, and I'll give the house away for free to a startup for a year for them to work out of it." And Ben and Lisa did all the work, and I ended up buying a house a couple of doors down from Ben's in this neighborhood that was a pretty rundown neighborhood. I mean, it'd been around for a while. I mean, it's sort of classic older neighborhood that the houses were probably, smallish houses that hadn't really been renovated. Cute, but not difficult, but nothing special. And I bought the house for $79,000. And I then ran a competition for it. So we made a bunch of noise around it. And what was happening all at the same time was a couple of other startups bought houses. So this thing called the Kansas City Startup Village started to develop around this part of town. By the time we made noise about it, I think there were 4 or 5 hacker houses, including mine. Suddenly, there was this attention on this part of town. And with zero government involvement, so this was all private sector, some of the houses started to get bought. A couple of the storefronts that were empty, you're hackers, you need a coffee shop. So all of a sudden there's a coffee shop, and then there was a restaurant. And so there was a little bit of retail that was starting to develop in this neighborhood that had none. And before you know it, other people are reaching out to me saying, was this a good investment for you? I'm thinking about buying a house in this neighborhood. And I think there are now 10 or 15 houses in that neighborhood, just that one neighborhood, that have startups in them. There's a huge concentration of startup community around that neighborhood. And it's 2 years later, a year and a half later, and my house was just appraised for $250,000. So the sort of growth of the neighborhood has been the revitalization of this neighborhood has been really powerful. Now, it's not the only thing going on in Kansas City, but it's a thing. And the point is that each of these individual things adds up. If you start to add up Kansas City Startup Village, you start to add up some of the things that Kauffman Foundation's been doing locally around entrepreneurship. You add up what Sprint's done with the Sprint Accelerator, which is done in conjunction with Techstars. All of a sudden, you've got this huge amount of activity in the startup community when 3 or 4 years earlier you had nothing. You had stuff, companies and things, but you had no connectivity between stuff. And I think, in this particular case, I think having fiber, well, for starters, I mean, it's old hat for y'all to sit down at your network and get, do a speed test and get 890 meg up and, 732 meg down. I mean, it's pretty mind-blowing the first time you do it. It's pretty awesome to open a browser window and put a YouTube up and have it buffer all the way, and then open another video, buffer all the way, open another video, buffer all the way, download something that you think is going to take 15 minutes and it takes 10 seconds. I mean, pretty awesome. I think what that did was it caused people to start to cluster close to each other because the Google Fiber rollout was very localized. And that density is another important part of what I talk about in the context of startup community, which is you really want the entrepreneurs to be on top of each other. You want them to self-organize the neighborhoods, but you want the neighborhoods to be dense. And the example I'll give you there, when I think about Boulder, 50% of the startup activity in Boulder happens in downtown Boulder in a 5 to 10 block area. So I've kind of stopped even thinking about, this Boulder as a city. I just think of it as a campus, right? It's it's kind of small compared to Microsoft campus, but it's a campus for startups because they're all over the place. They don't have to own the buildings, they have to control the buildings. They're just all over the place, and that density is powerful.
Among the Google city or the cities being considered by Google for their next wave of rollout is Nashville and Atlanta, both of which are approximately 120 miles from here. So it's pretty exciting from our side to think about Chattanooga being in the middle of a region that could have gigabit connectivity throughout. Are there things that we ought to be thinking about as a community to hopefully prepare for that would better position us so that we're ready to take advantage of it when it does happen?
Well, I think that fiber rolling out across the U.S. Is not a zero-sum game. I actually think it's something that is a net positive across the broad ecosystem. I personally think it's kind of embarrassing. Are you guys still there?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. It just blanked out for a sec. I think it's kind of embarrassing, as a country, if you think about our broadband infrastructure and our mobile infrastructure, wireless infrastructure, what we've actually got relative to, so many other countries. So I think it's a powerful thing that you have. And I think one of the neat dynamics about regions is that you're however many years ahead of either of those two cities in terms of understanding the dynamics that you're going to experience when everybody has access to much faster connectivity. Now, both of those cities are much bigger, so the dynamics are going to be different in terms of how it rolls out and problems of the digital divide and how you actually get people to have real access to this and have access to this faster bandwidth be something that's broadly ubiquitous rather than niche. Thinking about how you can provide some leadership in those startup communities as they're starting to roll out by saying, here are 5 or 10 things that we have done or we have seen that really make a difference in terms of our city. Less to do, I think, with entrepreneurship, but more to do with the dynamics of the city. And, I think Chattanooga is in a unique place because you're also, I think you're the only or one of the few in the U.S. examples where it was a fiber rollout that was tightly coupled with the local government, right? The only other one I know about is one in Utah, I think in Provo maybe, that recently failed and Google took over. But I think that's also interesting because those cities constantly want to figure out how can government, or I'd say in those cities, government is constantly saying, how can we help? And you have a very powerful example of where government was able to be helpful in a way that now you have to fill in the blanks for everybody else. But I would try to do that, and I would try to do that very visibly and proactively. So go to your friends in the startup community in Nashville, go to your friends in the startup community in Atlanta, and try to essentially infect them with the goodness that's Chattanooga and the experience Chattanooga's had well in advance of them spinning up what they're doing, so they incorporate that into their wiring.
Yeah, that's terrific, and it also very much falls in line with this concept of give first. So thinking about that, how do we help them would be terrific. I'd love to invite any of the audience to ask any questions, and if you could, you can come up here and I can hand you the mic. Anybody? Okay, we don't have that shy group. Here comes Mike Bradshaw, who's moving from tucked to untucked.
Well done.
And he hangs around entrepreneurs. He runs our accelerator. He hangs around untucked all day long. So welcome, Mike.
Brad, first I got to say your book has influenced my work tremendously. I was one of the recipients of that gift, and it's meant an awful lot to me. And today we had a chance to talk with David Weinberger, who wrote Too Big to Fail. And a lot of the things we talked about, you've actually already articulated these things. Now, Charlie mentioned measurement. And one of the things we talked about today was how do you take a really nonlinear kind of thing like startups are and apply the kind of measurements that those folks that do feed, that fund you, want to know about what your progress is, right? Is it number of mentors, amount of invested capital, all of these things, right, that you can quantify, but really I feel more like I ought to write a poem about it, for a grant report. So I'd love to hear your opinion about that.
So I think this is a really challenging and perplexing dynamic, and it's one that I'm going to put some real effort into trying to write clearly about in the next Startup Communities book. And I run into this all the time. Most of the metrics that get measured, most of the things that get measured are in the category that most startups talk about as vanity metrics. And for those of you that are not familiar with the phrase vanity metrics, these are things that are often relatively easy to measure, but don't mean anything. There are often numbers that are growing at something between a linear and a geometric exponential pace, and so the curves are are good. They're up and to the right, or I don't know whether I'm looking at myself in a mirror when I'm looking at myself, so I have no idea if I'm going to the right for you guys, but you get the idea. The but the essence of the curves are ones that they look nice, but they don't mean anything. The other challenge with vanity metrics is that scale is often manipulated. So, your x-axis is almost always time, but your y-axis can be whatever you want it to be. It's 0 to 1, it's 0 to 100, it's 0 to 10 million. And the people who are really clever figure out, how to take, use logarithms to make their charts look more smooth or better or whatever they want. So the biggest problem, the sort of starting point problem, is that the vast majority of things that get measured are vanity metrics. Unfortunately, most of the feeder organizations or funding organizations that are underwriting different activities are looking for these vanity metrics because in their organization, these things are the things that allow them to justify the investment. So it's number of people that attended events, number of people that came to Startup Week, number of dollars raised by the companies that go through the accelerator, number of events that you have per month. It's things that don't really matter. And what I've tried to encourage people to do, and what we've tried to do in Boulder, is we minimize the amount of discussion around those vanity metrics. We have some, so when people need them, they exist. But we don't get tangled up in managing to them. And instead, we take this much longer term view. Now, the other thing that's really challenging about this is you will have years of decline because of the macro cycle. So one of the things that, if you talk to an economist believes that healthy is that everything is growing at a constant rate year over year. And if you look at, our macroeconomist data, the macroeconomic data, in addition to being continually manipulated by changing what's in the denominator so that the numbers look differently, that data is often adjusted looking backwards to a point where it's not useful in terms of predicting what's going on or how you're doing. This really matters in the context of startup communities because your startup community should be able to grow and develop even if it's not linked to a macro cycle. Even if we're in a very positive bull market for entrepreneurship right now. Entrepreneurship is great. Everything's awesome. There's lots of great things happening. There's money flowing and there's companies being created. It's all positive. It wasn't so long ago that it was all negative, right? In 2008, 2009, the global financial crisis, the entire world was going to end. Countries were going to go bankrupt. Every financial institution was going to have to be nationalized. Currency would be worthless. And when I look at, for example, the Boulder startup community in 2008, 2009, some of the really iconic companies today, the companies that are viewed as leaders today, were either just getting started or were in very rapid growth curves. You see today, in 2013, 2014, the healthy companies, whether they're big public companies or whether they're companies that have been acquired for a lot of money, many of them were started in 2008, 2009, 2010. You have to disconnect from this sort of natural tendency we have as humans to measure things in a quarterly or annual cycle and try to use that to determine goodness. So punchline is, I like your idea of a poem. I think if you did something in iambic pentameter or maybe a sestina, it would confuse the shit out of the people. And that would probably be good because then it would give you a chance to have the conversation of actually, these numbers are not the important thing. These metrics are not the important thing.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Anybody?
Brad, Tennessee is a fairly unique state in the sense that we have an interconnected accelerator network from east to west. And one thing that we found as Launch Tennessee as a state organization when we take that view is that we're often trying to serve varying maturity in ecosystems. So we have some ecosystems that are highly developed and others that are just getting started. what are your recommendations? What are your experiences in trying to serve diverse populations when it comes to community partners?
I think it's super powerful. I believe that diversity is at the essence of innovation, and it's diversity on all dimensions. It's gender diversity, it's ethnic diversity, it's educational diversity, it's socioeconomic diversity. As human beings, we're pretty diverse creatures, right? We're all bags of chemicals. Literally, that's what we are. And these crazy different perspectives that we bring to things, different creativity is what drives innovation. And I think that's equally true in the context of startup communities. I think startup communities that think they know what's going on because they've got some maturity are being foolish. They're being insular. They're going to miss the next wave of what happens. And the example I'll give you is Detroit. At one point in time, Detroit was probably the most important startup community on the planet. 1950s, 1960s. I mean, it dwarfed everything post World War II. And I ran the Detroit Marathon in 2012, and there's nothing quite like being in a city that's built for 2.5 million people that now only has 750,000 people in it. It was insane. I mean, it's unbelievable how far that city has fallen. And if you look today at that city, there's some really amazing things happening. A lot of it's being led by entrepreneurs like Dan Gilbert, but many other entrepreneurs who are playing these leadership roles in revitalizing what is a very broken city. So I think that diversity of stage of development is super important, because the less mature startup communities don't have the constraint that a more mature startup community has of trying to satisfy and move things forward with a bunch of existing constituents and a bunch of existing points of view. The more established startup community can learn an enormous amount from the less established startup community, because it's going to be more flexible and be able to operate more effectively on trying new things. But it doesn't necessarily have the scale that the larger, more mature startup community happens. An example I give you again from Colorado is we have 4 major cities in Colorado: Boulder, Denver, Fort Collins, and Colorado Springs. They're all on I-25, which is the north-south interstate. And the drive from Colorado Springs at the south to Fort Collins at the north is about a 3-hour drive. It goes Colorado Springs, Denver. You sort of have to go off to the left a little to get to Boulder, because we're left, I guess. And then you go north to get to Colorado, or to Fort Collins. Boulder's the smallest of those towns. 100,000 people in Boulder, 2.5 million people in Denver, 500,000 people in Fort Collins, 800,000 people in Colorado Springs. 3 or 4 years ago, 2010, a couple years before I started writing the book, Boulder and Denver probably had the same number of startups, but Boulder's 1/20th the size of Denver. So it had 20 times on a per capita basis the startup activity that a city 30 minutes away had. Now, if you're the bigger city, what do? If you're an entrepreneur in the bigger city and you want to try to figure out what's going on. Well, the smart Denver entrepreneurs, instead of like being grumpy and, we'll figure it out, and those people in Boulder, whatever, they got in their cars and they drove down to Boulder, and they came to the startup community events, and they got involved in some of the companies, and they got involved in the startup community, and they learned about what was going on. They got embedded in it. And they essentially exported a lot of what we had figured out to Denver. Not all of it, and they created some new things. In addition, some of the Boulder entrepreneurs started going to Denver. They opened offices in Denver because they ran out of space for their companies in Boulder. 2 companies did that. A third entrepreneur, most of his employees in his company were from south of Denver. So he decided to open an office in Denver just to be in the middle. And all of a sudden you have cross-fertilization between Boulder and Denver. And this amazing thing starts to happen, is that both communities start to improve because they're building off of and learning from each other. independent of where they were relative to each other. So that's what I'd encourage. I'd encourage this intermingling, but it has to be going to the other thing. It's great that you've got this connected, but if nobody from Chattanooga, I don't know the cities, so I'm going to miss on the cities. But if nobody from city A ever goes to city B, you get no transference of information. And if nobody from city C ever goes to city A, you get no transference of information. So people need to be moving back and forth, and not just the people organizing what's going on, but the actual entrepreneurs need to move back and forth between the cities.
That's terrific. Thank you. Anybody else?
So we have a fair amount of capital here in Chattanooga. We have some funds that have got launched recently. We can support companies through the early stage, maybe even up through a Series A. But at some point, if we have a company that's doing well, they're going to have to go outside of Chattanooga to raise next rounds of capital, which is a good problem. I guess two questions. One, from the company level, what advice would you give them to get the attention of someone like you, someone on the West Coast, perhaps, if they have to go out there and raise money? And then also for Chattanooga and maybe some of the feeders here, do we have a role to play? Do we have an obligation to play to facilitate making that easier when those companies need to go out and raise that bigger round of capital that Chattanooga can do?
So let me try to answer both together with a framework that I like to talk about. And, you know, if you've read Startup Communities, you know that I talk about the myth of there's not enough capital here. I love that you started your comment out not by saying that, but instead saying, hey, we've got some capital. That, you know, clearly raising more and later stage amounts is something that we have to go somewhere else for, but we've got some capital. That's refreshing to me, because most people say some version of whining about how there's not enough capital here. And my first response to those people is, are there any rich people in your city? Like, let's stop the whining, right? Let's talk about it. Like, you're not doing a good job of getting the people who have money to engage with what you're doing. It turns out that there's three layers of capital, or three segments that I like to talk about. The first segment is seed money, angel money. It's the first $1 million or $2 million that you raise. The next segment is from, say, 2 million to 20 million. It's venture capital, it's institutional money. You know, you've got something that's working now, but you really need more capital to get it from it's sort of working to a real business. And then the last chunk is growth capital. Okay, you've got a real business here, and now you need to raise the pre-IPO round, or you want to raise a much larger round to go do some things, buy some companies, whatever. So it turns out, of those three layers, the top level, that growth capital layer, does not care about geography. It will find you. When you have a business that's cranking, they're looking for you. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go try to find them, but they will find you. They don't care whether you're in Chattanooga, Tennessee, or in Fairbanks, Alaska, or in Boulder, Colorado. The first layer of capital, which is that seed and angel layer, that is the most important to focus on as a startup community. And if there's a place for the feeders to help, my experience is it's there. It's trying to get people in the community to understand and engage with the new startups being created in the community. It's helping them learn how to be angel investors. It's helping them learn how to invest what is, for most of them, a relatively small amount of their net worth, or a very small amount of their net worth, in the future innovative companies in the city. And there's a lot of things you can do around that, not just the feeders, but also the entrepreneurs. But that's the segment that makes the most difference. When I think about what really accelerated Boulder, it was getting a lot of those very early stage investors, whether they be angels or seed investors or seed funds, focused on investing in local companies. The second segment, the 2 to 20 million, it's a bitch no matter where you are, including if you're in the middle of Silicon Valley. It's still a hard segment to raise, because there's so many companies fighting for that capital. So in that case, the mistake that so many cities, especially city governments, make is and state governments, they try to figure out how to get venture capitalists to come to their city, to invest in their city, to set up offices in their city. Waste of time. Just a waste of time. What you need is you need more companies at that seed stage starting to make progress, because a lot of them will fail. And those that fail, if you take what I said to heart earlier, are great investments for angel investors. I love investing another $25,000 check in an entrepreneur whose company failed, that I had $25,000 in or $50,000 in, because all of a sudden I feel like I'm just doubling down on the person. And that next investment, they've learned so much from that first investment. Why would I not double down on it? Trying to organize that next level, it's just so hard. And the thing that you can do, once you have these companies at this seed stage starting to, sprout through the ground, if you want to use a seed metaphor, some of them will grow. And some of them will attract institutional money, whether the institutional money is from the coasts or from somewhere else. All of a sudden, you're going to have an investor coming to Chattanooga. And the key is for that entrepreneur to share that investor. When that investor comes to town, if the entrepreneur doesn't let that investor see other things that are interesting, that entrepreneur is not helping him or herself or the community. So, when somebody comes to Chattanooga and they come for your board meeting because you've raised some money from a Boston-based VC, once a year say, hey, you know what? I want to have a dinner at my house, not for the board, but I want to invite some of the other entrepreneurs in town over that are doing some really interesting things. And I'd love to just have dinner, have you meet some of the other entrepreneurs who are doing interesting things. Now that I know what your firm likes to invest in, I think we've got a couple other really cool things here, and share that investor. The best thing that could happen if you're an entrepreneur with an out-of-state investor is that out-of-state investor says, hey, I'm coming a day early. Can you introduce me to some of the other neat things in town? Because I'm really excited about the opportunity to invest in Chattanooga. That won't happen in a year. That will take years, but that should be something that as a startup community, you're systematically building rather than trying to organize.
That's terrific advice. Thank you. Hey, Brad, do you have time for one more question?
Sure, one more.
Brad?
Yeah, one more.
One more. Okay. Jill, you've been trying to ask your question. Do you want to, or do you want me?
The question I had to do with your leaders and feeders, and we're trying to get different kinds of feeders to the table. And one of the areas that we're focused on is the corporate side. And I'm curious, we have a reverse pitch here tomorrow night, and I know that in Kansas City they've done one there as well. We're going to put a Tennessee twist on it here tomorrow. But what have you seen in creative sense about bringing corporate, the very tucked, if you will, into startup communities and getting them successfully engaged?
A couple things. One is recognize that large companies act primarily in their self-interest. And even when they're doing things for the community or doing things philanthropically, they're still acting in their self-interest. That's still the motive force in a lot of cases. So as a startup community, the magic of getting large companies engaged with what you're doing is to try to figure out things that they can do to help you that are in their self-interest. And putting yourself in the shoes of the big company and saying, okay, what does this company need? This company needs customers. This company needs partners that are building out things around its ecosystem. This company needs positive reputational effects because it's done some shitty things that everybody's down on, and so it's trying to do some stuff to build back up. The self-interest can be very murky and cover lots of different dimensions. But try to put yourself in the position of the large company and think about what you as a startup and what you as a startup community can do to help. The second is large companies are almost always by definition hierarchies, and startup communities are a network. And I alluded to this a little. I talk about it some in the book. I've written a lot about it. If you're in a network and you've ever tried to get something done in a hierarchy, you know how frustrating it is. And if you're in a hierarchy and you've tried to get something done with a network, you know how frustrating it is because they just behave differently. And in a hierarchy, people are, they accrue power by moving up the hierarchy, right? You're at some level in the hierarchy and you satisfy the norms of the hierarchy and you get a promotion. And as a result of getting the promotion, you're higher in the hierarchy, you get more power. In a network, that's not how it works. In a network, you get more power, not necessarily by having more people connected to you and being connected to more people, although LinkedIn would like you to believe that, that the more connections you have, the more powerful you are. It's actually what travels over those links. So having more links is only half the power of the network. The other is what you do over those links. The give before you get really plays into this, because if you're giving before you get, your node on that network can grow very, very large very quickly because you're putting a lot of energy out across links. You're collecting more links. All of a sudden, a lot more starts coming back to you. You become more powerful. If you're a startup community, and by definition, you'll be a network, your goal should be to get individual members of the large company, of the hierarchy, to be part of your network. And the goal should not necessarily be to get the CEOs to do that, because the CEOs are probably not going to be interested. And even if they are interested, they're at the top of their hierarchy, so they're not going to accrue more power that way. You get somebody that's responsible for engaging with the startups, engaging with the startup communities, and you give them a very easy way to become part of the startup community network. You be inclusive. You do things that help them be successful in the context of their hierarchy, and they will move heaven and earth within their large corporate organization to get benefit back to the startup community. So those are the two big things that I've seen over time. One is always recognize that these large companies are acting in their self-interest, and try to configure what you're looking for from them to be aligned with their self-interest. And the second is to work hard to get individual members of the large company engaged, part of the network of the startup community, rather than trying to like have this collision between your network and this hierarchy, which almost never turns into anything.
Yep. Great. Thank you. Listen, Brad, I know you have a lot of people pulling on your time. You're in high demand across the country and across the globe, really. So we really, really appreciate you taking an hour, a little bit more than an hour, to spend time with us in Chattanooga. And this has been really interesting and revealing for us, and we look forward to seeing you here for your marathon sometime, hopefully over the next year. And let's give Brad a big Chattanooga welcome.
Thanks. Have an awesome startup week.
What was that?
I said have an awesome startup week.
Okay.
All right. See y'all.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of the evening.